So we destined to make the best out of life. Crime connection.
Yo, I send shots to any man who comes too close. Niggas get fold like a letter to ship. Of course, coast.
Hello, 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 hello. Welcome to yet another college football video. We are doing another team spotlight today, and you guys voted and you chose the North Carolina Tar Heels. So I don't got much of an intro. Let's just get right into it. UNC, what are they? How far can they go? Where do I think they are and how far I think they can go? Let's get right into it. Let's talk about what they were last season. So they began the season unranked. At one point, they got as high as 13th, and they finished the season unranked. So started unranked, finished unranked. They did rattle off a 6-game win streak at one point in the season. And if you're asking me at this point in time where I have them at 22nd right now. If it were up to me, I would have UNC at number 22 in the country. Let's get into the schedule last season and what went wrong. You see a lot of red down there. Let's get into it. Started off the season on fire offensively. 56 followed by 63. Good Lord, that App State game was ridiculous. I don't know if App State had beat Texas A&M by this point, but oh my God. Imagine putting up 61 points in a loss. You got to fight everybody. That locker room had to have been a melee afterwards because, oh my God, 61 in a loss is absurd. But credit to UNC, they pulled that one out. Ended up beating Georgia State. Still not ranked, though, after 3 straight wins. That was surprising. Then they lost Notre Dame. I was hoping they won that game. Notre Dame was very weak. They were 1-2 at this point. And this was kind of the game that got Notre Dame back on track, while UNC very clearly, look at their defense the last 3 games to that point. 61 to App State, 28 to Georgia State, and then 45 to Notre Dame. UNC's defense is in full awfulness at this point. But then they pull it together, respectable defensive performances against Virginia Tech and Miami, with the offense clicking on all cylinders. A shootout versus a very good Duke team. That's a good win, along with the Miami game. I think both of those are very good wins. Along with Pitt. So this is where UNC, and keep in mind at this point, they're 6-1 with their only loss being to what we would come to find out was a pretty good Notre Dame team. So then they finally got ranked after their win versus Duke. Then they beat Pitt, another good win, 3 straight good conference wins. Then they beat Virginia close. Then they beat a good Wake Forest team close. So you can see that they're really starting to build some momentum here. And then the Georgia Tech game, I have to assume that they were just overlooking Georgia Tech because they didn't play Clemson in the regular season. I'm sure they were just looking towards the rivalry game against NC State in the final week of the season. They had to have been overlooking Georgia Tech because that offensive performance, just look at it. It was their worst of the season. At least up to that point. 17 against Georgia Tech. Come on, man. That was so disappointing. I kind of was. In the Texas video, it turns out I ended up kind of not rooting for Texas, but kind of just taking a key interest in them. Last season, I wanted UNC to do better than they ended up doing, and that Georgia Tech loss was the beginning of the end because they did not win the rivalry game against NC State. That was a close loss. All their close wins had kind of backfired up to that point. Look at that. Week 2 against App State, Week 3 Georgia Tech, Week 6 Miami, Week 7 Duke, Week 10 Virginia, Week 11 Wake Forest. They had got a lot of luck as far as the close games are concerned. And that all came crashing down in Weeks 12 and 13. And then they got pounded by Clemson. And then Oregon, respectable but close loss to Oregon. So they finished the season after such a hot start. What was that? Was that 9-1? A 9-1 start. They finished the season on a 4-game losing streak. So sad. So sad. And let's take a look at the team stats, what they were as a team, offensively and defensively. I think we know. Led by Drake May, this team was explosive offensively. 19th in the country yards per game, 11th best passing offense. The run game was nothing to write home about. It was Drake May was their leading rusher. That's unacceptable. Their running backs needed to do more than they did, and that is going to be a theme that we touch on here. 34.4 points per game, 26 in the country. They allowed a lot of sacks, but in a way, I mean, 102nd in the country is horrible, but in a way, you almost kind of understand it because of how much they passed and how much they had to pass, how many shootouts they got into. It is understandable in a way, but obviously something you point to and say that's an area they can easily improve in. And the turnover is only 24th in the country. That's something that, you would expect to be higher, especially for Drake May being as young of a quarterback as he was. He did a very good job at protecting the football. And then defensively, guys, if you know anything about UNC football, you probably know Drake May was on fire and their defense was uh, their defense was what these stats say they were. 116th, 116th, 86th, 102nd, 128th, tied for 105th. The only thing they were top 100 in the country in was giving up 165 rushing yards a game, just because no other team needed to run the ball against them. They could throw it wherever they wanted, however often they wanted to. It's like, and again, some of this is understandable because their offense was so good. It's like the Tennessee thing. You kind of expect a defense to suffer from a good offensive team because the other team is going to air it out and attempt to close the distance. So it kind of makes sense in that way. But a team sack should be so much. They might have been last in the country. I'm not. They might have got the least amount of sacks in the country, which is pathetic considering how often the other team had to pass against them. And then only 14 takeaways is so pathetic in that area as well. It's like, oh man, I could not imagine being a UNC fan and just watching the defense crumble week in and week out because these numbers, we I can personally guarantee we are not going to get to a team in these team spotlights with worse defensive team stats than this. It's atrocious. So let's get into the key players that they lost from last season's uh, team. Obviously, the two wide receivers are the key things here. Who were Drake May's top two targets from last season? It was Josh Downs, who went in the third round of the NFL draft to the Colts, I believe, and then Antoine Green, who went to the Lions, I think. I think the Lions in one of the later rounds. These are the top two guys. I mean, just look at the stats there. 1,800 yards combined, 18 touchdowns. Those were the top guys, and you lost both of them. Also lost to Asim Richards, who was 13 all ACC, started 14 games for them last season. And then you lost two big-time members of your secondary, Tony Grimes and Storm Duck. Storm Duck, what a name that is. But only five players. I mean, Texas lost a whole lot more than this. A lot of teams are going to get into. It's key areas. It's key position players as far as two cornerbacks and your top two wide receivers. It's key players that you do lose. Let's get into what they still have though, offensively. Obviously, we all should know who Drake May is at this point. He is probably the most impressive quarterback last season. And I do say the most impressive, even more so than Caleb Williams, because he already had the hype surrounding him. He had a year in the fire at Oklahoma. He had Lincoln Riley following him. Drake May came out of fucking nowhere. And I think just as far as difficulty, really carrying a team, Drake May, over 5,000 total yards and 45 touchdowns in his first year. Think about all these current guys that we consider are going to be new quarterbacks like Carson Beck, Cade Klubnik, Drew Aller, Joe Milton. Drake May had a tenth of the experience that all of these guys currently have, and he had over 5,000 yards and 45 touchdowns. That's what he did last season. He was UNC. Without Drake May, if they just had an average quarterback, this is probably like a 3 or 4 win team, if I'm being honest. Drake May put the Tarheels on his back. Let's look at their running back room. On paper, it's not that bad. I just don't know how they couldn't generate anything with these guys. Elijah Green, Amarion Hampton, Caleb Hood. You know, look at all the if you look at it like combined, you got like 1,500 yards from the three guys combined. Not enough, obviously. That's an area where they need to improve it because they got the talent. I don't think these three guys suck or anything. I think they have the talent. They just had to get it out of these guys to complement the tremendous, talent you have in Drake May throwing the football. And let's look at the wide receiver room because I mentioned Josh Downs and Antoine Green, going to the NFL. Who do you have left? You have your top leading receiver still from last year's team that's still there is Bryson Nesbitt. And let's get into the transfer receivers that they brought in. First off, first off, we have Devontae Walker. This is from Kent State, if I'm not mistaken. 12 touchdowns last season. 12 touchdowns, 950 yards. I have to believe that he's going to be the number one next season for UNC. And then you got Nate McCullum out of Georgia Tech. So two big transfer guys. These are key players because you lose your top two receivers. What do? You bring in two guys from the transfer portal who are used to being the number one guy on their respective teams. So that's something I really like a lot that UNC did as far as trying to go and address in the transfer portal their biggest losses from their team. And then the returning guys from last year's team who I also think could make an impact. You got J.J. Jones, Kamari Morales, a tight end, and Kobe Paysour. But I think the top three, if I had to pick, would be Bryson Nesbitt, Nate McCullum, and Devontae Walker in this receiving core, which I think is enough. I don't think offense is going to be the problem for UNC. I think obviously you could do a better job of protecting Drake May, making sure he stays upright more often. A better rushing game would certainly help, not putting as much pressure on Drake May to just do everything for the team. And the receiving core overall, I mean, if you get development out of guys like Bryson Nesbitt, J.J. Jones, Kobe Paysour, it could actually be slightly improved. I mean, if Devontae Walker is all that he lives up to be as far as the hype is concerned, I could see him filling Josh Downs' shoes. Nate McCullum certainly, I think, could do the job that Antoine Green did. I think the offense could be, and there's a very clear path for them to be even better than last season, which is very exciting if you're a UNC fan. But let's get into where this matters. If this defense is what it was last season, they're fucked. Respectfully, they are done for if this defense does not improve significantly. And what was their biggest problem last season? It was getting after the quarterback. Who the hell was going to do that this season? Well, obviously, the first person you look at is their leading sack leader from last season, if I'm not mistaken, which is Kaimon Rucker, down there on the left-hand side. 3.5 sacks from last season. You hope. I mean, they need him to, do much better than that. And they have a lot of linebackers here. Amari Gaynor is a transfer they got from Florida State. Him, Power Eccles, great name. Kaimon Rucker, Cedric Gray is kind of their leader, their best player, I would say. So, kind of a versatile linebacking core, kind of a deep linebacking core. Hopefully, guys who can also get after the quarterback. And then a secondary, I talked about how they lost Storm Duck, they lost Tony Grimes. These guys need a lot of help. But also, if you're a defense that doesn't get after the quarterback, that just puts your secondary in a tough spot. So it is a thing where I feel like if they can just improve in one area, if they're like USC, USC was not good defensively at all. But you know what they did? They forced takeaways. USC forced takeaways in key moments to give their offense a chance to win games, and that's what they did. That's how they won games. I'm not saying UNC needs to force 25 plus turnovers, but I mean, more than 14 would help. More than 14 turnovers in 14 games, by the way. That would help certainly a lot. So, quite frankly, they might have been the worst defense in college football, at least up there, besides like Colorado or some shit. It can't get worse, statistically speaking. You have to hope for some improvement here. So let's get into what the expectations are. Worst case scenario here. This is the worst case scenario. You have no run game yet again to support Drake May. The transfer receivers, they don't pan out. Like Devontae Walker and Nate McCullum, they do not do what you hope they could have done. No improvement for the O-line. Possibly even losing Asim Richards. They get worse in the offensive line. Defense remains UNC defense. They get dominated by Clemson and South Carolina, who they both play. They lose multiple games to conference opponents, and they drop a handout like Georgia Tech they did last season. That would result, I think, in a 7-6 record, assuming they make the bowl game, which I think is the worst case. I don't think this offense is too good to it gives them a floor of making a bowl game. I do not think this team misses a bowl game by any stretch, even if they are the worst defense in college football. I mean, this team had a case for being the worst defense in college football, and they won 9 games. So, when you're trying to put a floor on that team, it's hard to say they get, much worse than that. But I do think with their schedule, they could go 7-6, miss the ACC championship, obviously, some random, fucking mayonnaise bowl or something, and they remain unranked nearly the entire season. This, I think, is the middle ground. Slight improvement in the run game to take some pressure off Drake May. Transfer receivers, they just do what they're supposed to do. They replace the production of Josh Downs and Antoine Green. Offensive line improved slightly, very reasonable. Offense turns the ball over less than last season. Again, something I think is reasonable. Defense can't possibly get any worse. I mean, I think that's fair. They split games with Clemson, South Carolina. I would actually expect that to happen. They lose 2 or less conference games, and then they win a bowl game versus a high-level opponent. And in this thing, we'd have a 10-3 record. In this scenario, I think the most realistic scenario, narrowly miss the ACC championship in this scenario because they're most likely going to have a loss at Clemson. I think Florida State probably gets in there. Make a high-end bowl game, and I think that they would remain around the top 20 throughout the season. So slightly better than last season. I think they'd take that. I think most UNC fans would be happy with this. You're in the mix for the ACC championship all year. You have a couple really impressive wins, and you're just a fun and exciting team to watch. Then, then we get into crazy town, into what I think the best case scenario is here. What would that be? I think this would be Drake May somehow gets even better. Somehow, some way gets even better. The running game doesn't just improve, it becomes dynamic, it becomes effective. They can hang their hat on it. The receiving room is deeper than last year's, which I think, like I said, could be very possible. The offensive line improved significantly. Defense is top 90 in the country. You may laugh at that, but for a defense that was dead last to get top 90, that would be significant. Also, forcing turnovers, like I mentioned earlier, trying to become the East Coast USC. Speaking of USC, beat South Carolina in week 1. I think that's I'm going to make a video talking about week 1 games that could really affect the season. UNC South Carolina is going to be one of those games. Beating South Carolina week 1 is huge. Dominating ACC competition, losing just 1 game outside of Clemson, and like I said, have a 2022 USC type season. But not in the way you may hope. I think just as USC lost to Utah twice, I think UNC, even in this best case scenario, gets beat by Clemson twice. But I do think they'd have a very good bowl game, and they would beat another, very good team in said game. So in this scenario, best case scenario, I have them as 11-3 record, makes but loses the ACC championship game, appears in a New Year's Six bowl, and they're a fringe top 10 team all season. This would just be a dream outcome for most UNC fans. All of their hopes realized for the final Drake May season. And just like I said, such an exciting team with a bunch of close wins. But let's get into what I really think. What do I think? I laid out the 3 scenarios. What do I think is most likely? Let's get into it with a breakdown of their schedule. Who do they play? Where do I think is a trap game? Let's see. I think they beat South Carolina week 1. Like I said, such an important game between 2 high-level offenses that I do think UNC gets the edge in a high-scoring shootout versus South Carolina. They get their rematch versus App State. I do not think it's going to be 63-61, but I do think it's going to be a high-scoring affair yet again. And you may think after these first 2 weeks, oh my goodness, UNC's defense has got awful again. But they pull it back against Minnesota, I believe, starting off 3-0. And in this scenario, I think they'd be ranked in the top 20 by the time they play Pitt. But I do think Pitt is the first team that knocks them off, making them 3-1, going to Syracuse. Well, I don't know if it's in Syracuse, but playing Syracuse. And yet again, another 1-possession win, which I think they pull out. Then I have them losing to Miami. Let's be honest here. This conference schedule, Pitt, Syracuse, Miami, Duke, NC State, it's not easy. They don't, they avoid Florida State. But I mean, outside of playing, Florida State and Clemson, they got a pretty rough draw here. So I think Pitt and Miami both get the edge but then they rack up. This is when they start heating up. Blow out Virginia. Get their revenge against Georgia Tech from last season. Blow the brakes off, Campbell. Rest in peace to Campbell. That's going to be a massacre. Then a very interesting game versus Duke. Do not sleep on Duke this season. I think it's going to be similar to their game last season where UNC gets the edge in a high-scoring affair. And then their game against Clemson, it's going to be very important. Does Clemson overlook them? Or, does UNC just give it 110%? I think it's going to be a good game. A much better game than what we saw in the ACC championship, but I do think Clemson takes the edge. Narrow, 4-point loss to Clemson, and then they beat NC State in the rivalry game, Week 13. Finished the season strong, much stronger than they did last season. So a 9-3 regular season, and then a random bowl game as a fairly high-rated team against, let's just say Oklahoma. There's no skill in predicting who the hell they play in the scenario. Let's just say against Oklahoma, and they beat Oklahoma in the bowl game. You finish top 20, much better than last season. 10-3 record. You finish on a high note compared to last season. Make a bowl game, win a bowl game. I think this is highly likely, and I think this would be a very good outcome for UNC. You'd be showing improvement. You would get something substantial out of Drake May's last season, and above all else, you'd be an exciting as hell team to watch next season. Team I'm very excited to watch. But that's going to be it for this video, guys. Leave a like if you enjoyed. There will be a poll out around the time this video goes out to vote for the next team spotlight. Make sure to vote on that for who you want to see, and thanks for watching. Peace.
It's out the motherfucking pack. Right out the niggas don't know how to act.